So I took my teeth out, got down on my knees, and I'll tell you what, Mary, it wasn't to pray. Oop, hold on, gotta go, they're here. Sorry about that. Oh, my little frisky forceps, I hope you're having a great day so far. I am doing fabulous, and is there an ice pack in my crotch? You bet there is. I am in the cutest jacket ever. I wish you could see the whole thing. It's like a fit and flare, but it also happens to be made out of wool. Choices. And before we dive in, let's talk about today's drink. So we are driving to Florida in a few days, and so I'm actually trying to hydrate. While this does have a little alcohol, it's mostly fruit punch, but there's a little bit of blue curacao in there and triple sec. I haven't tried it yet. Let's see how she is. Ooh, that's good. It actually tastes like an apple. Wow, I like it. But speaking of drinks, y'all, get your drink ready and maybe water it down because today's story is full of suspicious. There is an ass ton of names here, but I believe in you keeping up. It's me who's bound to get a few names wrong. The main lady's name is Dorothea, and I guarantee you I will at one point probably call her Dorothy, which is extra confusing because there actually is a Dorothy in this story too. But just keep your titties upright and your eyes forward and we will be okay. So this story is very, very old. I've known about it for a long time, but then I saw it recently on Netflix's Killer Roommates or Worst Roommates Ever, some kind of roommate show. And so I'm like, people seem to be interested in this case again, but let's take it a little bit deeper. Giggity. But if you're a Killer Tour fan, maybe you've seen or heard of this house. It's 1426 F Street in Sacramento, California. Well, I'm gonna go out on a limb here and assume that when the tenants who lived at this boarding house first toured the home, they probably didn't expect this sweet little grandmotherly landlady to turn into a freaking murderous monster. But that, my fabulous and furry friends, is where today's story begins, in the capital of Cali in the 1980s. And this was a lovely place to live. People around the country were finding this out, so there was a sudden spike in population, and what does having more people lead to? Of course, more couples to swing with, but more realistically, more crime. And it wasn't just the crime rate that was going up in this cozy little sleepy city. The number of homeless people now walking the streets was going up, and you really can't blame them. I mean, California had a very generous benefit program for the homeless, and the weather is divine year-round. And really, the people who lived in Sacramento were totally cool with this. In fact, many of them tried to help, like Judy, who had an outreach program to help mentally impaired homeless people who might not have the capacity to locate all the services that they could get. Well, one of Judy's favorite clients was a 51-year-old man named Alberto Gonzalez Montoya, also known as Bert. Now, Bert, he suffered severe schizophrenia and also talked to voices in his head. And Judy really had this huge heart for him. Like, there was something about Bert's childlike nature that really made her take a liking to him. I think she just had a soft spot and was determined to find him a place so that he could get off the streets and in a safe place. She ended up lucking the fuck out and almost immediately found Bert a place downtown right next to the Capitol. And this place was often used for social workers, so she felt pretty confident in this move for him. And the address, honey? Well, 1426 F Street. And the street itself was, I guess, a bit run down, kind of on the iffy side. Like, if this neighborhood were a deli meat, it would probably be the questionable bologna off in the corner that's still somehow able to be sold for 29 cents a pound. Cheers to that mystery meat, bitch. But regardless of how the street looked, this house, it was like a diamond in the rough with its clean shutters and welcoming blue color and pristine garden and meticulously manicured landscaping. This was the shit. Like, as far as boarding houses go, the cream of the crop, you wanted to be here. And the cutest little landlady you ever did see would pop up at the front door, and to everyone, this lady seemed really fucking cool. Like, she'd probably roll a joint and light up with you while drinking a cocktail. Her name was Dorothea Puente, a woman in her mid-70s who'd been a battlefield nurse during World War II. And this little peach was a charity cherry. She would always donate money and clothes, and everyone just saw her basically as like a fairy godmother to the needy. But Dorothea, she kind of had a very colorful and interesting upbringing that led her to becoming a boarding house owner. Like, she had gotten married at 16 to a World War II soldier and ended up having 2 daughters in the 40s, but she didn't cope well with being a mom and ended up sending one child to go live with relatives, and she put the other kid up for adoption. The husband comes home and is like, where the fuck are the kids? Like, what the hell happened while I was gone? And Dorothea's like, surprise, we don't have kids anymore. Yay, cheers. As one could imagine, this definitely caused a rift between the couple, and her husband ended up filing for divorce in 1948. But then 4 years later, Dorothea finds love again and ties the knot, but begins tipping the bottle pretty heavily. Not only that, but she was a little bit cray-cray and would create characters and believed that she was truly that person. Like, when she told everyone that she was a Muslim of Egyptian descent, like, girl, please. Her new hubby was a salesman and often had to leave the country for work, and this really pissed Dorothea off, so she'd get back at him by sleeping with other men during his travels. Makes sense. You'd think think most people would be like, oh, I don't have to blow him because he's away and I get to spend his money. Best deal ever, but no, not her. She needed cash fast and realized that she had a talent for pleasing gentlemen suitors. And so over the next few years, while she was still married, she became a sex worker and eventually opened up a brothel. But then she ends up getting caught and is arrested. Just all around, young Dorothea sounds like a really stand-up kind of gal, doesn't she? Meh. Well, random person sexy time just wasn't enough for her. She decided to also gamble every penny of her husband's money away. All of this while regularly shacking up with a cop on the side. Well, this husband finds out about the brothel and the sex work and has her committed. And she's like, psh, that crazy shit was just an act, you dumb sluts. And the cop's like, oh, okay. So they end up getting married and have the most fruitful and longest relationship that she's ever had, a whole 14 years. Cheers to that cop for putting up with bullshit. Whew. Eventually, the cop does realize that Dorothea's psychopathy is actually quite real and is kind of fucking dangerous. So they finally divorce. While doing this, she ends up finding another man to pole dance on named Roberto Puente, whose name she ended up keeping even though the marriage only lasted like a fucking week or a couple hours. Shit. It's like a celebrity marriage. She may as well have been in Hollywood. Grandma was a busy bitch, wasn't she? Well, now she was approaching her upper years and was realizing that, holy shit, I've done a lot of bad things in this world. I really need to clean my act up. So she started this boarding home and made it her life's mission to help anyone in need. She'd even hire local parolees and do yard work and welcomed individuals into her home with open arms who had substance abuse and mental issues. And a lot of people that lived with her were also kind of creeping towards their elder years, and it just felt like a safe place for them. And everyone living there kind of had interesting lives. There was James, who was a 62-year-old man with literally nowhere to go and a huge-ass brain tumor. Then there was another woman named Dorothy Miller, who was 64 and an alcoholic. There's Betty and Leona, who are both in their 70s, but don't have enough pennies between the two of them to buy a Twix bar. And what's weird is that everyone who was living there received government assistance, yet sometimes they never saw their checks. It was the darndest freaking thing. Just super fucking odd because Dorothea was the one to always check the mail, but she'd be like, sorry, nothing. Oh, that's suspicious. Cheers to our first suspicious shot. Oh, the first of many. Or if the tenants did get their checks, Dorothea would figure out a way for them to work the system and milk it to get them even more money. But nobody thought this was suspicious because Dorothea was such a giving and charitable woman. She was known all around town and was celebrated for having a huge fucking heart. By the time Bert moved in, there was only one tenant left that hadn't moved out, 62-year-old Vera, who happened to only stay a few nights after Bert's arrival. She just upped her ass and left without saying a thing, which really wasn't that uncommon for a boarder. New tenants began trickling in, like 64-year-old Johnny, who is a retired cook and doesn't touch the hard stuff. Can't relate, Johnny. Can't relate. In fact, unlike Johnny's room neighbor Ben, who had more alcohol than blood in his system and would spend his entire government check on liquor and could usually be found at the ER for being too fucking drunk. But before anyone knew it, Ben had checked himself out of Dorothea's and disappeared, which wasn't even a surprise to a social worker. Once again, another traveler's stay was short-lived and Dorothea moved on to help others. Meanwhile, Bert is just loving life with Dorothea. Judy came in for a checkup and he had a nice haircut, he was clean, he had fresh clothes, smelled like bubble bath and cinnamon rolls. This was perfect for Bert and Judy was as pleased as a Polish plum. So over the summer months of 1988, Bert is just living his best life and absolutely thriving. He'd finally found a good skincare regimen and his conditioner was really helping his dandruff, but then in November, a call to the police came from a woman about a missing person. The woman calling was Judy and the missing person was Bert. An officer named Richard meets with Judy and she tells him that he'd been at this place for the past 6 months and from what Judy had gathered had planned on living there forever. So it really didn't make sense that he would up and leave, especially on his own. Well then one of Judy's co-workers walks in and says, oh my god, guess what happened to Bert? He apparently went down to Mexico with a few other tenants to visit Dorothea's brother who was a doctor, so not suspicious at all. So Judy calls up Dorothea and Dorothea's like, yeah, Bert is down south of the border and he'll definitely return within a few days with a fresh tan. But when weeks go by and his ass still ain't back, Judy calls Dorothea and is like, suit your girdle up, lady, I'm bringing in the po-po. A couple days after that, Judy gets a phone call from someone and they're like, hi, my name's Michelle, and I have Alberto with me. He's my nephew and he's in, Utah. Suspicious? Look at all that. I'm like, woohoo! I told y'all to water your drink down. If you're crawling after this story, it is not my fault. Okay, maybe a little bit. I'm such an enabler. Judy calls Dorothea, who says, you know what? Sunday while I was at mass, a relative came in and picked Bert up and left a note. Judy's like, my lily white ass, I'm calling the police, you double-crossing duty head. Dorothea's story had more holes than a gay bar's bathroom stall, and shit just did not add up. So Miss Judy calls up Officer Richard and is like, look, something is up at this house, and there's a tenant named Johnny who can give the true story. He's sober, he's trustworthy, he just doesn't have the funds to be out on his own right now. So Richard goes to Dorothea's house, and she's as lovely as ever, gives him cookies and a cup of coffee. She shows him around, he talks to Johnny, who in fact confirmed that Bert indeed said sayonara the previous morning. Richard's like, cool tits, man, everything checks out, I'm out of here, have a good one, I'm taking another cookie. So he walks out the door, but behind him comes Johnny to open up the front gate, and as he's opening it, he slips Richard a note that says something like, meet me at the park at noon. So, if I gave a guy a note like that, you can sure as shit bet it's not to talk about a missing person, wink wink. So they meet, and Johnny's like, this lady asked all of the tenants to fucking lie for her and say that Bert up and left with his relatives. And then he starts telling the officer about all the weird shit that's been happening around the house, like the sound of something being dragged down the steps after the alcoholic Ben moved out. And there was always this pungent smell coming from one of the rooms upstairs, and there were fresh holes always being dug in the yard. He thought maybe people were being buried there? Can you say suspish? Glug glug, sassy queen. Woohoo! Well, then Richard contacts Detective John from Missing Persons and Homicide, and they instantly get to work. Detective John starts looking into all of Dorothea's history and quickly found that she was actually on federal parole for cashing fraudulent security checks and for putting stupefying drugs in her victims' drinks. Like, okay. And now this lady's just out there roaming the streets? This doesn't seem right. And weirder yet, several times throughout the past few years, Dorothea had posed as a nurse and drugged her elderly patients to steal their jewelry, their money, their checks, their crockpot recipes, anything she could get a hold of. Earlier, when the police had arrested her in 1982 for these crimes, they'd found a ticket to Mexico in her purse. Like, she had totally planned on robbing these people and then running. She ended up getting like 5 years in the slammer, but was taken out after 3 for good behavior and probably for slipping the guard her oatmeal cookie recipe, or for slipping the guard her biscuit. Not a pretty image. Whew! She ended up moving that ass right back to her home on F Street, right where she'd been living just before her arrest. And everything just kinda clicked for the detectives. Bert was a gold star victim. He was getting up there in years, he'd been collecting Social Security, hadn't really been able to defend himself, didn't have many people looking for him, but because he was legally independent, he could legitimately have simply left without anyone knowing. He was the perfect target for someone like Dorothea. Detective John is reading everything he possibly can about Dorothea, and something stops him dead in his tracks. This little old lady who had to be at least 75 actually wasn't elderly. In fact, she was only 59. She lied to everyone about her age. She had her hair done up in a typical 70-something style. She had no teeth, so with all of this, she just looked much older than she actually was. Detective John meets with Judy to spill the tea, and he's like, so what do you want us to do? And Judy's like, go to the freaking house with some shovels, man. So, homicide detectives John and Terry arrive at Dorothea's home with a parole agent. They explain that they're there about the disappearance of Bert, and she doesn't seem fazed at all. She says, oh honey, let me help. And she goes on and on about Bert's relatives and was very believable with it all. Like, she would look directly into your eyes and tell you exactly what you wanted to hear, which is totally not the sign of a serial killer. She didn't even bat an eyelash when detectives asked to check her house, and they checked everything under the beds, and they tapped the walls, but they also knew that Bert was kind of a big guy, so if his body was stuffed somewhere in the house, it would be pretty obvious. There was no sign of him, but when they went into Dorothea's room, they found 2 pill bottles. One was almost overflowing with little blue pills, and the other one was empty next to her bed. But both of these bottles had the name Dorothy Miller printed on them. The officer takes the empty bottle downstairs to Dorothea and is like, who the fuck is Dorothy Miller? Dorothea says, oh honey, that's just a relative of mine. Don't worry about it. She visited and must have just left this behind. Okay, Dorothy. Ooh, I'm spitting everywhere. Well, the officers really couldn't fight that. It could totally be true. So before they leave, Detective John asks Dorothea if they can do some digging in the yard. And she's like, why? He tells her that they just heard through the grapevine that there might be bodies buried out there. And without flinching, she's like, oh, do what you need to do. In fact, she even assisted them in getting extra shovels. So the guys start digging, and what do they find? Nothing. So they dig a little deeper and started seeing pieces of material come up with the dirt, and they're like, what the fuck? Well, then they started digging up what seemed like small leather discs that they just added to the pile of material. But soon their shovels really wouldn't go any deeper because they had hit a tree root and couldn't dislodge the root. So Detective Detective John climbs in this hole and starts tugging at this root to pull it out, and he was yanking and yanking till it finally broke loose. He falls back with a root in his hand, only to find that this is not a fucking root, this was a human leg bone. And that was how this all started for Miss Dorothea, or maybe I should say how it all ended. The detectives call Dorothea over to look at the hole, and she meanders on over, acting all frail, and gives the most dramatic theatrical gasp when she approaches the hole. They'd shown her a giant freaking leg bone and now a foot encased in a shoe that they just uncovered. And Dorothea was just all of a dither over this, like, goodness me, how could this be? And she was acting all nervous, telling them she had no idea about any of this, and she was actually believable. They recognized that the material they had unearthed seemed to be from like a dress or a blouse, so immediately this turns into a crime scene. The art is taped off, and CSI comes in to photograph everything, and this was now a proper fucking shit show. Unfortunately, nobody was tiptoeing through the tulips of Dorothea's garden that day. There was quite a commotion going on. All of the dirt being dug up was collected and sifted for evidence, and just a little bit below that leg bone was the remains of an elderly woman, definitely not burnt, but equally as suspicious. After they exhumed the body, they decided maybe we should go a little bit deeper, and they basically dug up the entire freaking yard, which this story kind of reminds me of our Dean Coral story. Remember that bullfuckery? The total creep who had buried multiple bodies all over a storage unit and like stacked them. People are fucked up. Anyways, the police realized that though this yard is small, this would take a lot more digging than what they could just do by hand. So they have a backhoe come in, and no, I'm not talking about my ex. While they're digging, Dorothea goes up to Detective John, is like, so am I under arrest or something? Like, what's the sitch here? Well, at that time, she wasn't, so he responds, no, why? And she says, well, all of this is just making me nervous, so I was kind of thinking of maybe going and having a cup of coffee with one of my relatives at the hotel around the corner. And to the police, this was a matronly little lady. Nobody suspected for a second that she could hurt a fly, let alone murder anyone. She wasn't a flight risk, and she was being so helpful and so nice, so cops were like, yeah, go ahead. But this didn't really fool Detective John. He thought Dorothea was too nice, too helpful, and she raised so many red flags. But he really couldn't prove anything. Even though he's suspicious of her, he still walks her to her hotel and returns to the digging. He's shoveling away and once again hits another tree root, except this time they knew better than that. It was no tree root. He reaches into the dirt and pulls out a fully clothed fresh leg. What a shitty morning. Poor dude thought he was just gonna go get coffee, have a chill day, but now he's eating a whole vat of steaming suspicious soup. At this point, it had been a few hours since he took her to the hotel, and everyone is like, where the fuck is Dorothea? Peeking around trees, lifting up rocks? Nope. Detective John directs them to the hotel, but when they run over there, she's gone. Wow, surprise. As if we couldn't see that coming and steaming hot from a mile away. Everyone was realizing that the reason she wanted to leave in the first place was because their shovels were probably 2 feet from another body. Granny Clampett knew that shit was about to hit the fan and did not want to be in its pathway. Nobody expected Dorothea to bolt, and when newspapers got a hold of this story, it created a huge-ass media frenzy. A little old lady who actually wasn't old and had killed tenants and buried them in her own yard and was now on the run. Juiciest shit Sacramento had seen in years. So the police begin the search for her while more bodies are being uncovered. The third body they found was wrapped up tighter than a Cuban cigar in bed sheets and a comforter and plastic, so clearly this wasn't a random act done by a newbie. This was like an experienced killer. While the digging continues, one of Dorothea's neighbors comes over and tells the police that last May, there had been a sick, nasty stench coming from her yard that was so potent he couldn't even use his damn air conditioner. And in California, that is a damn crime. So he knocked on Dorothea's door to tell her about this, and she told him that she just put some fertilizer out in her yard and he was probably smelling that. Like, she was quick, you gotta give her that. She was a total fucking psycho, but she could have been an amazing actress and made money by, you know, not killing people. Well, then that neighbor shows the police a discovery he'd found just that morning. 24 human teeth, all filled with silver and gold fillings. It kind of seemed like maybe she'd collected them from her victims and then chucked the little bitches over a fence when the police showed up. So detectives are like, we gotta get this shit going and fast. And their minds were always working. Like, the first thing they did was collect a list of boarders that had stayed there over the last year and a half. And instantly, Detective John notices one of the names, Dorothy Miller, the supposed relative of Dorothea's who owned the empty pill bottle. Weeks go by and there's still no sign of Dorothea, and more bodies are uncovered, and once again, they're wrapped in bed sheets and plastic. And with more bodies, they were discovering a bigger timeline, some bodies had been buried for a year or two, some just for a couple months, and some even just for a few weeks. This was not a pretty sight. It was not a good smell. Onlookers were vomiting left and right. This was an absolute nightmare. And people start to wonder, how could this little lady dig all of these deep holes? Well, it turns out that all those parolees she was hiring to do yard work were actually digging graves. They had no fucking idea that they were doing that either. They would just say, yes ma'am, drink some homemade lemonade that Dorothea would bring to them, and keep digging. I think Dorothea may have told them that maybe she was putting in shrubs or something, but police also discovered that one of the parolees that worked for Dorothea was named Don Anthony, and this was who Dorothea had hired to call Judy and act as Bert's relative, which immediately connects Dorothea to Bert's disappearance. A few days later, someone digging suggests that maybe they moved that shed in the backyard to see if there's anything underneath it, and sure as shit, they find a shallow grave with a fresh body. 2 hours later, they find yet another one buried underneath the statue of the Virgin Mary. But what was different about the body underneath Mary was that there was no head, no hands, and no feet. They were cut off so that whoever found the body wouldn't be able to identify them. At this point, cops are like, we are sure as shit that she did this, so they obtain a search warrant to go back into Dorothea's house and snag over 300 items of evidence. And they find a book that's literally called Drugs and Their Effects just sitting there on the kitchen table. They were like, check this shit into evidence and label it as Dorothea's cookbook. And next to the book was Dorothea's driver's license, except it had her picture on it, but not her name. It kind of seemed as though she'd take her victims' IDs and put her photo on them, just in case little mama had to run. While rummaging through the house, they start to catch whiffs of something nasty, a smell like what the neighbor had described smelling last May. They follow this odor to a room, and when they open the door, it's like death froze over, then heated up slowly in a human 100-degree oven. They'd found the room that Dorothea would keep her dead victims, and the body would be in this hot room for a week, 2 weeks, and just decay. And then the body juices would leak out and pool onto the floor and just rot the wood. And the point of the story, the shit was nasty. And then they rolled the rug up in that room, and underneath was a soggy body juice soaked mess that almost went through to the ceiling below. I once left a banana in my backpack for the whole school year, and I could tell it was rotting, but I'd always forget to take it out. And after a whole year, this banana smelled like a fucking death daiquiri, so I couldn't imagine what this whole room smelled like. Cops are like, how in the hell was all this shit just laid out in the open? Her medicine book, her fake IDs, this whole freaking room? It's all because she was just so trustworthy and so sweet seeming. Nobody suspected a damn thing, and now the lady was on the run. This was some juicy shit, man. Literally. Ugh. And what happens when shit gets juicy? The media has a fucking field day, except in this case, it was actually helpful. Like, they had media coverage in Japan, Europe, Canada, literally all over the world, which made it really hard for her to hide. Of course, if she really did want to hide, all she'd have to do is pop in some teeth, dye her hair, and she'd look like a completely different person. But now with all this media coverage, the house kind of became a tourist trap where people were coming from all over and lining up blocks down the road just to get a glimpse of the crime scene. It was just an absolute mess for all the detectives and everyone trying to dig up these bodies. Meanwhile, the bodies they did find are taken to the medical examiner, and they first start looking into the leather discs they'd found above the first body. Turns out it was the human flesh petrifying and falling off of the bone. Not a good thought, because Detective John had even put it up to his nose to smell it, and it was literally a human potato chip. I'll take a drink for him just for doing that. At least he didn't lick it. Hello. But the examiner was having a little bit of a tough time identifying these bodies. They were just too decayed to lift fingerprints, and this was way before DNA was really a common thing. And with no prints, they'd have to look at dental records, except all but one of the victims even had teeth. So then they thought, why don't we just get a list of everyone who's collected Social Security at this address for the last few years? So they did, and holy shiitake mushrooms, Clint Eastwood, you'll never guess. Dorothea had still been collecting Social Security on several people, even though they didn't live there anymore and hadn't really been seen in a while. Could the bodies maybe belong to them? Ooh. Dorothea was still collecting on Vera, Dorothy, James, Betty, and Leona, all of who Dorothea said left ages ago. And since all of these people had been in Dorothea's care, nobody had reported them missing because nobody knew they were missing. Like, Dorothea was a terrible person, but a clever little wench when it came to choosing her victims. She picked people who didn't have family, or really anyone that even knew they existed. Except one family, one single family, had been looking for 77-year-old Everson. He hadn't called his family for almost 5 years since he'd left home and headed to California to go marry his bride. Who might that bride be? Why, none other than Miss Dorothea Puente. But the weirdest thing of all is that from 1986 to 1988, though he didn't call, the family would receive letters from Dorothea about how she and Everson were traveling the world and living a gay, happy life. And it wasn't even until the family saw this case on the TV that they called the police to ask how Everson was coping with all this. He must be worried sick. The cops are like, who the fuck is Everson? But then as media coverage spread even wider, calls began trickling in from people that had family members stay with Dorothea and had weird shit happen. Like Ruth Monroe's son, who called the detectives about his mother. In 1982, she'd been like 61 and just couldn't bear the thought of living alone after her husband had been diagnosed with terminal cancer. She had a catering business with her friend, and the friend's like, hey girl, I got you. I have a boarding house with lots of empty rooms. Come live with me. I'll give you one guess who this friend was. A couple weeks after the move, Ruth's son is visiting and sees that his mom, who had never drank in her entire freaking life, was milking a cocktail Dorothea had mixed for her. He's like, cool, mama's being a little bit loosey-goosey, get it girl. A few weeks after that, he goes for another visit, but now his mom was bedridden and couldn't move. I think he thought that maybe she had some kind of flu or just a quick illness, so he's comforting her and saying, Dorothea will take care of you, you'll be fine. And he left. The next day, he gets a call saying his mom had died and he was just standing there in utter shock. How could this be? A month ago, his mom had been healthy as a horse, starting this new journey alone. Well, when the autopsy comes back, it's labeled as undetermined overdose, meaning she killed herself. The son was like, this shit is super suspicious. Like, yeah, she'd been sad about her husband's illness, but she would never resort to self-destruction. Well, that's not what Dorothea had told the medical examiner, though. According to her, Ruth had been suicidal the moment she'd arrived, and she wasn't surprised at all by her friend's passing. How convenient for Dorothea, especially because it wouldn't be until after she was on the run that they'd find out the truth. What a clever little bee. Detective John finds out that at the time of Ruth's death, this was when Dorothea was about to be sentenced to go to prison for imitating a nurse and drugging the elderly, so she had needed funds for an escape, and Ruth's Social Security had been her ticket, literally. Remember when Dorothea had been arrested and sentenced to 5 years? The ticket to Mexico found in her purse had been purchased with Ruth's money. Like, all Ruth wanted was a friend, and all Dorothea wanted was Ruth's check. Like, how fucking sick and sad. But with all the puzzle pieces starting to slip into place, detectives add Ruth's name to Dorothea's growing body count. At this time, Dorothea was still on the run, and they were getting calls from all over the US about seeing her. Until finally, the LA police got a phone call from a handyman saying he'd just spent an enchanting evening at a local bar having drinks with Miss Dorothea. Or at least somebody that kind of looked like her. He wasn't quite sure because that's not the name she'd given to him, but what did they talk about the entire time? The Social Security he was receiving. Which, how the fuck do you talk about that for an entire evening? God damn, get a hobby. But later that night, he'd seen on TV this woman who was trying to scam and kill people, and he was like, holy fuck, I can't believe I almost made whoopee to this woman. The police go to the motel that the man says Dorothea was at, and when she answered the door, she gave a completely different name. The police are like, girl, stop, we know it's you. And so she broke down and said, yeah, okay, I'm Dorothea. And she really opened up to these studs in uniform, giggity. But she told them everything, all about cashing in on the Social Security checks, and was apologizing the entire time. There was no mention of ever hurting anyone, but this woman was basically the Meryl Streep of killers. It was just so believable that she was truly sorry. The police bring her into the station and media's all over it like flies on shit. Who would ever believe that she would hurt a single soul? Here's this elderly, old, grandmotherly woman who wanted nothing more than to give you warm cookies and milk. Detectives couldn't yet prove that Dorothea was even responsible for any murder, but they were working around the clock to try to identify the 7 bodies they dug up in her yard. The first body they dug up had tattoos all over it, which they found belonged to the alcoholic Ben Fink. For the rest of the bodies, the pathologist could only lift fingerprints off of 2 of the victims. One was Dorothy Miller, the supposed relative of Dorothea's, whose pill bottle was in Dorothea's room. The second set of fingerprints belonged to Bert. Poor Bert. And then by process of elimination, they were able to figure out the last victims. There was James, Leona, Vera, and Betty, making it so all 7 of the bodies had finally been identified. But they still couldn't find the cause of death. Still, there was a common factor with all of the bodies. They'd all been wrapped up in plastic and duct tape and sheets, which kind of told them that these people were probably killed by the same person. So Detective John put out a bulletin to nearby stations asking if any bodies had been found wrapped in a similar style. And sure as shit, one county had. A few years back, they'd found an elderly man wrapped in plastic, the same elderly man who had left to go marry Dorothea. By 1990, she's ordered to go on trial for 9 counts of murder. The prosecution calls up almost 160 witnesses and have over 3,000 exhibits. But even with that, it was still really fucking difficult for them to even pin Dorothea. Like, none of the witnesses saw Dorothea do anything wrong, let alone bury anyone. Plus, the coroners weren't even able to figure out the cause of death for the victims. But just because they can't figure out the cause of death doesn't mean Dorothea didn't kill them. This was obviously murder because a majority of the bodies were wrapped and bound. Like, these people didn't just dig holes and climb in themselves. This was clearly intentional. On trial, Dorothea doesn't deny stealing these people's social security or even burying the bodies in her garden, but she kept saying, I did not kill them, they died of natural causes, which was actually really believable because most, if not all of her boarders actually were pretty sick and they may have actually died naturally. And then to continue collecting their checks, Dorothea would just bury the body. But this is still just too fucking fishy. Even if they can't find the cause of death, they were trying their hardest to at least prove some kind of murder. The jury deliberated for 43 days, at that time the longest deliberation in California history. Well, out of all 9 victims, she was only convicted of murdering 3 of them. 4 of the bodies in her yard had an 11-to-1 decision, meaning 11 people thought she was guilty, 1 thought she was innocent. The other 2 bodies were just split down the middle, so all they could do was charge her with first-degree murder in the deaths of Ben Fink and Dorothea Miller, and then second-degree murder in the death of Leona Carpenter. The judge is like, this is knuckin' futz, we have a serious mistrial with the other 6 bodies. Nonetheless, she was sentenced with 2 life terms without parole and then an additional 25 to life for the 3rd body. Poor Judy ended up throwing in the towel as a social worker after this case. It was just so heartbreaking for her. Bert's and 5 other victims' murders had just kind of been thrown away. Like, even if they proved Dorothea was guilty of all the killings, what would they do? Just keep adding more life sentences? She was already past her prime, like there's not going to be much repentance for her. As one could imagine, all the victims who had family left are still to this day traumatized by Dorothea's actions. Ruth's son still thinks about seeing his mom paralyzed by poison just laying in bed, and after work some days he's like, okay, I'm gonna go visit mom, and then he realizes she's been gone for a while. Dorothea ended up dying in 2011, and now the home is actually a tourist attraction, and there's a plaque in the front yard that says, it was the awful, awful woman that did it, don't blame me, and it's a quote from that house, basically saying, don't hate the house, hate the person who lived in it years ago, and trust me, we do. But yes, isn't that just a wild and crazy, sick, disgusting, twisted fucking tale? With a lot of these stories that we talk about, the killers or the serial killers could have been so much more had they not done illegal shit. Like if they actually spent time focusing on their craft, like with Dorothea, it could have been acting. People could have made an honest living doing that. Like Dorothea didn't even have to act. She could have actually had a boarding house and made a decent living. But instead she had to be a selfish, shady little shit about it. And it's just so sad to me. But I think the saddest thing about any of these cases is how one person's actions affect so many people. Some of her victims were grandparents, they were uncles, they were sisters and brothers, and their families will no longer know them. Their grandkids will grow up without a grandparent, and all because Dorothea wanted money. That is the true villain here, the dollar bill. But anyways, my loves, what do you think about this story? Comment down below if there's any little tidbits that I left out. There were so many facts on this case that I just couldn't include everything. And I know these stories are pretty dark, and it's kind of the opposite of what we represent on this channel. But with that being said, thank you so much for being here and allowing these victims' memories to carry on. I, for one, am just grateful that you are here. So really, thank you. And if you want a little bit more me in your life, please check out my Patreon. It's patreon.com/Poplux. You get videos a day early. You get Patreon-only content. And best part, it is cheap, fun, and fancy, just like me. And like always, please be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell down below so that you're notified anytime I upload a new video. Don't forget my newest collection of highlighters, including Black Ice, which does change from black to white, will be available again soon at thepoplux.com. Also, my latest album, Kiss of Fame, is available everywhere online that music is sold. Thank you so much to everyone who's supporting them. Comment down below, let me know what you thought of this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe. You can follow me on Snapchat, Instagram, and Twitter at OfficialNady, and you can follow me online at thepoplux.com. Thank you so much for watching. I love you all, and I will see you again soon. Bye!